The invitation arrived without a return address, sealed in thick ivory paper that felt too expensive for something so simple, and yet there was nothing simple about it, because each of us received the exact same letter, written in precise, almost mechanical handwriting that revealed nothing about the sender except an unsettling attention to detail, and the message itself was brief, almost polite, requesting our presence at Blackthorn Manor for a private gathering, promising answers to questions long buried, a phrase that lingered in my mind far longer than it should have, because I'd spent years ensuring certain things remained buried, as had the others, though none of us would admit it aloud. We arrived one by one, as if summoned rather than invited, each pretending surprise at seeing the others while silently calculating what it meant, because this was no ordinary reunion, not for people like us, not after what had happened 10 years ago, and Blackthorn Manor itself seemed to understand that, looming at the edge of the cliffs like something abandoned by time, its windows dark, its walls weathered by storms that never seemed to reach the rest of the countryside. And as the iron gates shut behind us with a final echoing clang, I felt the distinct and unwelcome sensation that we had not just entered the estate, but something far more deliberate. There were 7 of us in total, though none of us said the number out loud because it carried a weight we all recognised. A reminder of the 8th who was not there, the one whose absence had shaped everything that followed. And as we gathered in the grand hall exchanging hollow pleasantries and cautious smiles, it became clear that no one knew who had arranged this meeting, which meant either someone was lying or someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure their involvement remained invisible, neither of which was comforting. The house itself was immaculate despite its isolation, every surface polished, every object placed with unsettling precision, as though it had been prepared specifically for our arrival, and yet there were no staff. No signs of recent life, only the faint ticking of a clock somewhere deep within the walls and the occasional creak of wood that sounded less like age and more like movement, subtle, deliberate, almost watchful, and I could feel it then, that creeping awareness that we were not alone, even though there was no one else to be seen. Dinner was already laid out when we entered the dining room, a long table set for 7, each place marked with our names, written in that same precise handwriting from the letters, and for a moment no one moved, because it was one thing to receive an invitation, but another entirely to realise that someone knew exactly who we were, where we would be seated, and perhaps most unsettling of all, what we had done, and yet hunger and curiosity overcame hesitation, as they so often do, and one by one we took our seats. It was only after we had begun eating that the first crack appeared, subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, when Daniel, seated at the far end of the table, paused mid-sentence and frowned at his wineglass, turning it slightly as if inspecting something inside. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of confusion that quickly gave way to something else, something sharper, more urgent. As he said, there was something written on the inside of the glass, something that hadn't been there before, and as the rest of us leaned in, straining to see, I felt a cold, familiar dread settle into my chest, because I already knew what he was going to say before the words left his mouth. 8, he whispered. The room fell silent, not because the number itself was frightening, but because of what it implied, because there were only 7 of us at the table, and yet the glass insisted otherwise, and before anyone could laugh it off or offer some rational explanation, the lights flickered once briefly, and in that single moment of darkness, I swear I heard a chair move. When the lights returned, there were still 7 of us sitting there, but one of the chairs was no longer empty. No one spoke at first, not because we didn't want to, but because something about that moment made words feel dangerous, as though speaking would confirm what none of us were ready to accept, and yet our eyes all drifted to that chair at the far end of the table, the one that had been empty only seconds before, now slightly pulled back as if someone had just taken their seat, though there was no one there. Nothing visible, nothing we could point to and explain away, just the unmistakable impression of presence, heavy and deliberate, pressing into the room like an uninvited thought. Daniel was the first to break, pushing back from the table so abruptly his chair scraped loudly against the floor, the sound sharp enough to make us all flinch, and he demanded to know if this was some kind of joke, his voice rising with each word, grasping for control in a situation that offered none, but no one answered him, because the truth was painfully obvious. None of us were in control. Not here. Not anymore. And as his gaze moved from one face to another, searching for guilt, for reassurance, for anything that might ground him, he found only the same fear reflected back. Then came the voice. It wasn't loud, nor was it distant. It was perfectly clear, as if spoken from just beside us, yet it belonged to no one present. A calm, measured tone that carried an unsettling familiarity. The kind you recognise not because you've heard it often, but because you've tried very hard to forget it. And it said only one thing at first, a single sentence that seemed to settle into the walls themselves. "You remembered me." The effect was immediate, like a crack running through glass, because we all knew that voice. Even if we refused to admit it, even if we had spent years convincing ourselves that what happened back then had been necessary, justified, forgotten, suddenly the room felt smaller, the air heavier, as if the manor itself had drawn in closer to listen. "No," Margaret said, shaking her head, her voice trembling in a way I'd never heard before. "This isn't real, it can't be." But denial has a way of sounding hollow when it's confronted with something that refuses to disappear, and the voice responded not with anger, not with accusation, but with something far worse, quiet amusement. "Not real?" it repeated, almost thoughtfully, and then the lights flickered again, longer this time, plunging the room into darkness that felt thick enough to touch, and in that darkness, we heard movement. Not just the scrape of a chair this time, but footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the table as if examining us, as if choosing. When the lights returned, everything appeared unchanged at first glance. The same table, the same faces, the same oppressive silence, but something was wrong. Something subtle yet undeniable, and it took only a moment to realise what it was, because Daniel was no longer standing beside his chair. He was sitting, perfectly still, hands resting neatly on the table, his expression calm, far too calm, the panic from moments before completely gone, replaced by something vacant, something distant. And when I called his name, he didn't respond and didn't even blink, just stared straight ahead as if listening to something none of us could hear. And then, slowly, he smiled. It was not Daniel's smile. It stretched too wide, lingered too long, and as his head tilted ever so slightly toward us, he spoke again. But the voice that came out was not his. It was that same calm, measured tone layered over his own like a shadow that didn't belong. 7 now, it said. The words hit like a physical blow, because we understood instantly what they meant, not just the count, but the implication behind it, the shift from observer to participant, and Margaret let out a strangled cry, pushing back from the table as if distance alone could save her, but there was nowhere to go, or the doors had closed without us noticing. The windows reflected only darkness, and the manor, silent and watchful, had become a prison. I tried to think, to find some rational explanation, some way to impose logic onto what was happening, but every possibility fell apart under the weight of what we were seeing, what we were hearing, and beneath it all a single memory began to surface, one I had buried deeper than the rest, because it was the one that mattered most, the one that connected all of us, the one that explained why we had been brought here. 10 years ago, there had been 8 of us, and we had all agreed that one of us had to die. The memory didn't return all at once, it never does, it crept in slowly, like something pushing its way through cracks we had tried so carefully to seal, and I could see it happening to the others too, the way their expressions shifted, the way their eyes darted not just around the room but inward, searching through years of denial for a truth they had hoped was gone, but the manor wouldn't allow that. Not anymore, because this pun's place, whatever it was, had been designed for one purpose: to make us remember. It had been a stormy night, 10 years ago, the kind that isolates you completely, where the world outside feels unreachable, and we had been here then too, all 8 of us, drawn together by ambition, by greed, by something we had convinced ourselves was justified. And when things went wrong, when the situation spiraled beyond control, we made a decision, a collective, calculated decision that we never spoke of again, because speaking of it would mean acknowledging what we truly were, and so we chose silence instead. We chose to forget. But someone hadn't. The lights flickered again, violently this time, plunging us into darkness that seemed to pulse with something alive, and Daniel, or whatever now wore his face, stood slowly from his chair, his movements unnaturally smooth, almost deliberate, as if guided by something else entirely, and when the lights returned, he was no longer at the table, he was behind Margaret. She didn't have time to react. His hand closed around her shoulder, not with force but with certainty, and when she turned, her scream caught in her throat as she met his eyes, because they weren't his anymore, they were deeper, darker, filled with a knowing that went beyond anything human. and when he spoke, the voice was layered again. His and that other one, perfectly aligned. "You chose me," it said. Margaret collapsed before anyone could move, her body hitting the floor with a dull final sound that echoed through the hall, and just like that, there were 6 of us left, though no one needed to count. We could feel it, the number pressing in on us, shrinking, tightening, and with each loss, the presence in the room grew stronger, more defined, as if it was rebuilding itself piece by piece. "We had no choice," someone whispered. I don't even know who. Maybe it was me, maybe it was all of us. Because that had always been our defense, our justification, the lie we told ourselves over and over until it felt like truth. But the thing wearing Daniel's face tilted its head slightly, almost curious. "There is always a choice," it repeated. And then the truth came flooding back, not just the memory, but the feeling of it. The fear, the desperation, the moment we realised one of us had to take the blame, had to disappear, had to be sacrificed so the rest could walk away untouched. And how easily we had agreed when it wasn't us. How quickly we had turned on the one person who trusted us, who never saw it coming, and how we watched as it happened, convincing ourselves it was necessary. The 8th. We never even said their name again. The manor seemed to react to that realisation. The walls creaking, the lights dimming to a sickly glow, and one by one the others began to panic, shouting, running, trying doors that would not open, windows that reflected nothing but darkness. But it didn't matter. Because this was never about escape, it was about balance, about finishing what we had started. 6, the voice said, and another fell. Then 5, then 4, each one taken in a way that felt almost deliberate, almost poetic, as if the manner of their end reflected something about who they had been, what they had done, and all the while the presence grew clearer, stronger, until it no longer needed Daniel's body to speak. Until it stood among us not as a shadow, but as something we could almost see, a distortion in the air, a shape just beyond understanding. When it was only me left, the silence returned, heavy and complete, and for the first time since arriving I understood. This was never about revenge, it was about truth. "You remember now," it said, not as a question, but a certainty. And I did. I remembered everything, including the part I had hidden even from myself, the part where, in that final moment 10 years ago, when the decision had been made, when the others turned away, I had been the one who stayed behind, the one who made sure it was done, the one who carried it out while the rest convinced themselves they were innocent. I wasn't just part of it. I was the reason it happened. The presence moved closer, the air growing colder with each step, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not fear, not exactly, but something heavier, something closer to acceptance, because deep down, I knew this was inevitable. That this moment had been waiting for me long before the invitation ever arrived. 8, it whispered, and suddenly I understood the number. It was never counting who was alive, it was counting who was guilty. The lights went out one final time, and in the darkness, I felt something reach for me, not violently, not cruelly, but with a certainty that left no room for resistance, and as everything faded, as the manor, the voices, the weight of it all slipped away, there was only one thought left, clear and undeniable. Some things don't stay buried. They wait.